Good morning. Thanks for saying that. I want to talk today about a resilience challenge that is very large, global climate change. But I want to start somewhere much smaller and more familiar to all of us, the family dinner table. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go to one of my alma maters, Emory in Atlanta, and I sat in a couple of doors down on a psychology department presentation because I didn't take any courses in psychology when I was there and heard they had a good department. And it was very interesting. They were talking about their work studying adolescents and what makes them resilient. In the Family Narratives Project, Dr. Robin Fivish and her colleagues have zeroed in on the importance of having family meal times together. And they tried to understand what it was about that. Was it the nutritious food, as we've been hearing about drive-thrus and McDonald's? Was it something about the act of just coming together around a dinner table as opposed to having the kids in the back seat and making eye contact? Or was it something about the conversation itself that boosts these teens' resilience as they go through life? Well, it turns out that where we have dinner is where we often come back together and talk about how our day went. We share good and bad that comes throughout the day, and we often convey what it means to be a member of our family in the process. So think about it. I mean, we come home from work and we say, hey, I got a promotion today, and you could celebrate that, or the children's news of a good test score, or yes, a field goal or a goal in soccer, or a field goal in football, if it's sports related. But we also share our bad news as well, maybe a setback, maybe a rough day at the office, even losing a job. These are important opportunities to model how we deal with life setbacks. And often we bring into the narrative stories about other family members, maybe family members who came before that the children don't even know. So in my own family, for example, a grandfather who died before I was born, who I was told sold newspapers during the Great Depression, until he had the opportunity when he was selling papers in the Fairmont Roosevelt Hotel lobby in New Orleans to meet then Governor Huey Long and said, can you keep me in mind if something opens up? And sure enough, he did, and told him about an opening in the police department. So he was able to get a really good job at that time. Or my grandmother on my father's side, who I did know, but I always heard that she had lost her sheet music in Hurricane Betsy. And Hurricane Betsy happened in 1965, so I don't remember it, but I thought, she and my grandfather lost everything. Why are we talking about this sheet music all the time? But in 2003, during Hurricane Isabel, that memory literally came flooding back as I was standing in my own basement in a couple of feet of water, trying desperately to rescue important papers and photos. My son, who was young, thought it was really quite fun. He was floating around on a little area rug like it was a magic carpet and surfing the waves. And I was just going through everything trying to save these birth certificates and photographs. And sure enough, I stumble on this cardboard box that's waterlogged with my own damaged sheet music. And instantly I remembered that story about my family, my grandmother losing her sheet music in a hurricane, and here I am losing my sheet music in a hurricane. And oddly, it made me feel very confident that I could get through this because I knew my grandmother and grandfather went on to live long and happy lives. So it really gave me some resilience and some help in that moment. Well, a couple of years later, my son and I made room in our home in Arlington for family members and friends of theirs and lots of pets that lost their homes in Katrina. This is my sister's house before and after. She and her husband, Terry, lost just about everything, along with my mom and aunt and uncle and various other family members and friends. And we learned at that time that losing your community, and at the time it really did feel like the whole community was lost, was so much more traumatic than losing your individual home or anything in it. I saw my sister, Beth, and her husband, Terry, battle PTSD and work their way back to New Orleans after several months, eventually moving back into the city, and then this year battle a much smaller flood, but a flood no less, in Hurricane Isaac, without even shedding a tear. And I thought to myself, there's a lot of us that those who work on extreme weather events and preparing people can learn about resilience from my own people, my own family, these communities, and other communities that have gone through what they have. So in combination with those family stories, some work that we do at the Georgetown Climate Center, conversations that I've been lucky enough to have with my friend Nancy Keat, who's somewhere out there from Rockefeller Foundation, and terrific books like Amanda's book, Unthinkable, which she didn't talk about today, and Andrew's book and Anne-Marie's. I put together some observations, and I look forward to a conversation about it. First, proper planning and preparation can save lives and so much more heartache than if you don't have it, as we saw in New Orleans. When I asked my friend Justin Johnson, who is a senior official in Vermont's Agency of Natural Resources, what accounted for the towns that after Irene's devastation, Hurricane Irene last year, what about the towns that bounced back? What was different about them? And he thought for a second, he said, you know, the towns that have nuclear power plants are required to have paid emergency personnel. And so unlike the towns with just volunteers who are just trying to deal with their own families and their own jobs, they had the wherewithal to anticipate the challenge at hand, which was a flood, realize, oh, by the way, we're located in a floodplain, get themselves and their equipment, computers, but also the heavy equipment, out of harm's way and out of that floodplain so that they were in a much better position to help themselves and others when the storm came. So having professionals and a plan and resources really, truly matters. But having said that, my second point is this. In the midst of a disaster and afterwards, sometimes homegrown citizen-based solutions are the most successful and enduring. Beacon of Hope started in the Lakeview neighborhood where my sister lost her home, right by the 17th Street Canal Breach, that one that really famously pushed houses off their foundations, by a neighbor of hers, Denise Thornton, who started to rebuild in her own kitchen, learned from that experience, brought her neighbors there around her kitchen table, and started to teach them what she was doing. It spread out across Lakeview, it spread out into Gentilly, the neighborhood where my mom had lived, and eventually even into Laplace after Hurricane Isaac last month. They were there within days. Other groups, led by people like LaToya Cantrell, who leads the Broadmoor Civic Improvement Association. And these people don't come in with externally imposed solutions and clipboards and tell you what you need to do. They're from the community, and they know what works and what doesn't, and they've lived it. People like my friend from high school, Wendell Pierce, who you might recognize from HBO's Treme, who is trying to bring fresh groceries back and other services back into his parents' Pontchartrain Park neighborhood. Which brings me to my third point. Traditional models of who's in charge in a disaster do not necessarily operate when you have a real disaster. So, I mean, who would have thought that actors like Wendell Pierce or Sean Penn, who saved people in his boat, and look what he's doing in Haiti now, or Brad Pitt, who's rebuilding the Ninth Ward with these sustainable houses, would be the people that we turn to in times of crisis. And even those in less lofty positions have stepped in. Amanda writes in her book about a busboy that saved lives in a major fire when his superiors, he couldn't get their attention. And again, a Vermont story where a young farmhand actually just had the wherewithal and the logistical skills to really start pulling together teams of men, including his farm owner boss, and put them to work and get them into some of those communities where governments can't. We saw this important role that volunteers played in my own family because in living with me in Arlington, we did not find some of the major charities and certainly the Road Home program, the government program, to bring people back, very helpful or accessible to them and to their friends. And yet, all the houses were required to be gutted that were damaged, whether or not you had the wherewithal to move back into the city and to move back into those houses. And who helped them? Well, it was volunteers. It was this huge core of volunteers. They came from churches, they came from school groups. They gave up their vacations, they gave up their spring breaks, and they didn't just do this for one house or 1 year. They did it house after house, year after year, neighborhood after neighborhood. And I think these are really the unsung heroes of New Orleans resurgence. And those who benefited, like we did, from their help will never forget. And I hope that those of you who are in a position, through government or through your foundations, to support them will realize that this important role that these volunteers play and help get them support in the future. But unfortunately, given the challenges that we're seeing with climate change already, volunteers alone are not going to solve our problems. Last year, we had over a dozen $1 billion weather catastrophes in the United States. That's more than we had in a decade from 1980 to 1990. Wildfires in the West, the Mississippi River flood, Irene, the tornadoes in Joplin and other places, disasters are on the rise. This year we had 30,000 records broken this summer, heat records. We had half the country's counties labeled as disaster areas. We had a lack of a winter in much of the country, which meant that pests like the pine bark beetle and mosquitoes could overwinter, wreaking havoc on our forest and killing people at record numbers. And of course, last month, we saw a record low for the Arctic sea ice. And we know what that means for our coasts. So what can we do to start to adapt to these changes? There are things that we can do to look at our roads and our rails and try to build them differently so that they don't buckle under sustained heat. We can literally build our culverts that carry stormwater differently and bigger, because when it rains, as the climate models predicted, it actually does pour. And for those who are in water-stressed areas, we can find ways through pricing and policy and technology to conserve that precious resource that we need. Our work at the Climate Center at Georgetown tries to help communities not only deal with the causes of climate change and cut back on their greenhouse gas emissions, which we certainly do, and it's certainly important, but also to move from planning for adaptation to actual implementation. And it's not as easy as you might think. There are questions about what scenarios of climate change to consider, whether or not they have the legal authority to change their practices, whether or not they're allowed to spend their federal funding in a certain way. And this might all sound mundane and bureaucratic, but keep in mind that the reason why Mayor Nagin did not call for a mandatory evacuation of New Orleans until within 24 hours when that Category 5 storm slammed into land was because he was spending a few days checking with his lawyers. Our work is at Georgetown Law School, and we help communities like Washington, D.C. and Milwaukee look at what kind of tools, like cool roofs and green roofs, urban forest canopy, what laws do you have in the books to incentivize these or to require these. We look at what their options are for these and what their policy options are, and we put these in toolkits that can be shared with others. We also do this in the area of sea level rise, which is, of course, a consequence of climate change as well. So we look at some of the existing zoning tools like setbacks or buffers, building houses differently to accommodate more water, retreating from the water to make way for important natural ecosystems to migrate, like wetlands and beaches. And again, we put these in toolkits that are available to anybody so that they can inform their own decisions in their own community, thanks to a clearinghouse that has over 1,000 resources, not just ours, that are there for everybody to see and to change their infrastructure and their design differently. But no matter what we're doing on infrastructure and design, the human element is very important, and this is my fifth and final point. We need to understand how people make decisions to leave when a crisis comes. 1,836 people died in Katrina, and many of them were elderly. Some of them did have access to transportation, but they chose not to leave. Some of them stayed behind in neighborhoods like my mother's in Gentilly, where they lived in single-story homes, and they didn't have the wherewithal to fight their way out of the attic in the heat and the darkness when the storm came, and they died. So why did they stay? I have a few theories based on my own family's experience. One, I don't know about your family, but my family, the older people are very set in their ways. They like their stuff where it is, they like their life the way it is, and they don't really like to move around a lot. And this is especially true when people have disabilities. My mother is legally blind, physically disabled, and as the day goes on, she gets a little confused. She gets a little confused about where she is, even in her own space. That kind of dementia is common in older people. And so you can imagine how stressful it is to move in advance of a hurricane. Some of them didn't leave before Katrina because they were already undergoing medical treatments. The woman across the street from my mom didn't want to leave because her husband was in chemo, and she thought that he'd miss the appointment the next week. People stayed for dialysis. My aunt didn't leave from Hurricane Isaac last month because she had been in the hospital 4 times since August for breathing problems. Others don't leave because they think that the evacuation itself, could be as dangerous and stressful as staying behind. And there's some reason for this. You might recall that the year before Katrina, there was Hurricane Ivan. It was this huge storm bearing down on the Gulf Coast, and everybody thought that was going to be the big one. And everybody evacuated pretty much, but it wasn't mandatory, and they really hadn't worked out the contraflow, which allows you to use the inbound lanes that are normally inbound to go outbound and to evacuate. So a lot of people ran out of gas, it was hot, it was stressful, people had heart attacks, and some died. My own father, Sid Arroyo, had been turned away from a hospital heart test as the hospitals go into lockdown before a storm comes. So he and my mother went to a hotel, and he never made it to that heart test. He never made it back home. He went directly from the hotel to the hospital, where he died in the emergency room. His heart gave out right before his 75th birthday. My sister Beth sent this picture of the picture just a couple of weeks ago because it was right around the time of his birthday. And that's why it's a little blurry, because she just took a picture of the picture. The unfortunate lesson that people took from losses like ours is that it was just safer to stay. And remember, this was just a year before Katrina. I think another reason was because available transportation and shelters didn't allow people to take their pets, often these people's only companions. The next year, Congress passed the Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, which does spell pets, to recognize, clever, they're very clever that way, to recognize this fact that people don't always leave just because you have tremendous models that tell you that the storm is coming, and you might even have the infrastructure to protect you. And by the way, a mandatory evacuation had been called. They don't always leave. We have to look at this human component in order to save lives. So at this point, you might be wondering, why do people stay in South Louisiana anyway? James Lee Burke, the novelist, calls my hometown, his hometown, an insane asylum set atop of a sponge. With its hurricanes and storm surge, sea level rise flooding wetlands, formaldehyde in the FEMA trailers that people are rescued into, and then now Chinese drywall as they're building their houses and they have to get out of them again because they're getting sick. Oh, and by the way, throw in a catastrophic oil spill while you're at it. It's not for the faint of heart. When I was flying back home to DC after helping out after Hurricane Isaac last month, I thought to myself as I looked at out the window and saw water getting ever closer to New Orleans, it's not so much that we're leaving South Louisiana as South Louisiana is leaving us. But it's more than a shrinking boot on a map if you follow the familiar contours of that state. A state, by the way, which provides a lot of energy, a navigational system with those ports that are so valuable to our imports and our exports, fisheries, and so much else to our economy. For those of us who are from there, it's a way of life and a unique culture that literally defines who we are. My son, who was 7 when he floated on that rug in our basement after Hurricane Isabel, and was 8 when we buried his grandfather, my father, after Hurricane Ivan, and who was 9 when we welcomed my family into our homes after Hurricane Katrina, is now 16, the same age as PopTech, a teenager. He has been born and raised in Washington, D.C. and its surroundings from day one. But that's not what his Facebook says. His hometown, New Orleans. I've never asked him why, but I suspect it has something to do with what those Emory psychologists have found and our own family dinner table that expanded when we had family and friends living with us and then contracted again. Our family narratives link us across geography and generations. They ground us and they give us roots and connections that literally help us weather life's challenges. For those of us who work at the macro level trying to build resilience in communities, it's really important to understand these narratives to get and keep people out of harm's way. And at the personal level, these narratives can provide one of the greatest gifts we can give our own children: to be, in a word, resilient. Thank you.